Hi, this is the final part of our conversation with Dr. John Kappa about moving beyond judgment. In this final program, we talk about how to respond when you have been judged by others and ways to move forward into this space we call moving beyond judgment. Hope you enjoy the program.
So what would you say to somebody listening who's experienced judgment from the church or from others and has been wounded and pained by that judgment? How do they respond? And also, I guess, a subsidiary question, which is how do we who are seeking to follow Jesus shift a little? What are some of the practices we can do to shift a little?
Yeah. The first tragic confession we have to make is that this is not uncommon. A friend of mine said to me once that one of the biggest mission fields in the world is those who feel hurt by the church. Footnote, in many cases, it's a real hurt. In some cases, it is possible to blame the church for our own failings and our desire to leave, and I accept that happens. But let's accept on face value that all communities hurt people. Rotary clubs, bowling clubs, humans gathered together bring together both the best and the worst of individual human lives. And we've got to accept the church as both a wonderful but also a broken institution. It's no excuse, but it's a reality. To recognise that hurt is not uncommon is tragic, but also, I think, encouraging. We all live in that space of broken communities. I certainly, I've met, as I know you have, Jules, with so many people who've been in that space. And my encouragement to them is to not give up, because God doesn't give up. And if it truly is God they're seeking, then the community is merely a vehicle, and an imperfect one, but one that God continues to use. So how do we get the best of connectedness with others? I think the answer to that is by giving of our best, by recognizing that it's our contribution that will be judged by, not other people's contributions. And we will actually, in the long term, be shaped better by how we've embraced the challenges, the critiques of others, than by how quickly we ran away. Though the running away is fully understandable. I put a footnote in there. There are churches, as there are families, as there are workplaces, that are downright abusive, that are toxic. A great term, I think, tragic term, but a real term. We've got to get out of those places. There's nothing godly gained by staying in a place where the paradigm is hurtful. But that's a small minority, I think.
Yeah.
I think that was the first part of your question. What do we do when it's been done unto us?
Yes. And I guess the second part was a question about how do we who are still inclined towards wanting simple, straightforward answers move into a space of openness, maturity, where we are able to move beyond judgment. What are some practices? What are some spiritual habits that we could develop, perhaps, that enables us to suspend judgment and go beyond just suspending, but actually find a common space and common place to share with others?
I'm a bit of a fan of the Croatian-born theologian Miroslav Volf. And even the title of one of his books, Exclusion and Embrace, which, is partly his story, partly his understanding of the gospel, partly his expression of what it means to be Christian community, has been pretty helpful to recognize that at one level we've all been excluded and we've all lacked embrace, but in God's economy we've been embraced back into a place of love. whether by the community or whether otherwise, the miracle is to see that it's God doing that.
Yes.
But also to recognise that it's part of our calling to be people of embrace. I'm a person who prefers to live in their own head, but over the years, I've learned that hugging is a really good thing to do when people are comfortable, all those sort of things. I've kind of tried to learn the social cues. It's because we are embodied, because we're called to embrace. And as I've learned that about myself, I've also been amazed to see how often in the scriptures Jesus touches people, those who he shouldn't have touched. And I don't mean that morally, I mean socially, the outcasts, the lepers. He holds out a hand to them. He recognizes them not for their symptoms, not for their disease, not for their situation in life, but for their humanity, for the image of God in them, if you like. He sparks that in them and they find acceptance, embrace, if you like. I think that's amazing. Maybe this isolation that we have to endure at the moment is God's way of saying, well, you've got to learn now, John, not to be going around hugging everybody, but to find other ways of inclusion and love. That's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah. I wonder if there's also something about the sense of being embraced ourselves, and that we've not done that for one another in a way that creates health in one another, so that we're then able to embrace the other ourselves, so that we're still living with our own wounded souls, our own fractured sense of selves, and the only way through that is as community, and which I guess it's why church exists, so that we can then be in a space of healing and wholeness, and learn how to tentatively reach out to others, and not be so caught up with ourselves and our own lives.
It's a big question.
Yeah.
As you were speaking, the little phrase, which I think came from one of your fellow country persons, statespeople, that resentment is drinking poison and hoping it'll hurt your enemies.
Yes.
It's a glib statement, but I think it's also a true statement. And the challenge is we can't, in and of ourselves, just get over ourselves.
Yeah.
We need help with that.
Yeah.
And I think for me, as a Christian person, of course, that's God's help that comes. But it comes in many ways. It can come through a careful interior journey. It can come through spiritual direction. It can come through a good psychologist. But mostly it comes from a loving community.
Yeah.
And I think it's really hard to be a loving leader and a loving member of a broader community, whether it's being a member of a board or a committee, or whether it's being part of a sports club or a church group, unless your own immediate community is a place where there is trust and nurture. So marriages and families are critically important places. That's not to put pressure on us, but that's to encourage us to work out our identities in those most intimate of places. So I think that does flow on. How we speak of our spouses in public is really significantly important. How we speak of our family members, to honour our parents, even though in my case they're long since departed. What does it mean for me to live in a way that honours that heritage? And at least at a starting point, it's speaking with honour whilst recognising their imperfections.
Yes.
As I hope my children both recognise mine and yet put up with me and love me. And certainly Wendy has been the channel of grace and love for me to understand what it means to be loved, and out of that to find flourishing in life.
And I guess it's also, for me, it's also something about if you're not part of a community that enables you to feel that a little bit more whole, by being part of this community, then the community is not working very well, whatever that community is. I mean, I can recall experiences, not necessarily church communities, but for example, I had a period of unemployment about 30 years ago, and we're going to a company that helped you find work or gave you temporary work, and the community I experienced from the staff members was more grace than I think I've ever experienced almost anywhere else. I mean, it's slightly hyperbolic, but there was something that stuck with me that I remember to this day, 30 years on, which made me feel better for having been in their presence. And some people are really good at that, and there's nothing spiritual or religious about it. It was just something of the grace of God in the way that little organization conducted themselves, and that common place of grace, as it were. And so finding places like that would seem to me very energizing, healing, something that can restore the soul.
That's a fantastic story for a number of reasons. I mean, I too have found that incredibly powerful grace in a shared purpose, even with an incredibly diverse group of people. It's a wonderful thing. I think my parallel would also be that there are plenty of other people who can tell you terrible stories about their outplacement service or their, career counselling or whatever.
Yeah.
Let's recognise that we can't dismiss the whole church based on a few bad ones. We can't dismiss all employment services based on a good one or a bad one. Somehow this is the nature of human society. But as part of the wonder, the fact that you and I are talking about it after 3 decades is very, very significant.
Yes.
And I can relate to some. One of my most recent ones was I did the company director's course. What a nerdish thing to do. But it was an amazingly good fun time sharing with people. But it was around a small cluster. It was a tiny part of our lives. There was stuff that defined us in that room, but which wouldn't necessarily give us any reason to meet up other than that. Yeah. Whereas I think the challenge for us as Christian community is we need that sense of shared mission. And you see that happening in our local church on Monday lunches, where lunch is provided for anyone from the community who wants to come, and many do come. They come for the food, but they also come for the fellowship and the sense of inclusion. Mm. And at the end of the day, not only are those who've come fed, but those who've fed them have also been fed and nurtured in their shared mission. Now, you can focus it down to very tiny pieces of missional activity and use them to build fellowship. Well, that's not a bad thing. That's an outcome, but it's not an intention. The bigger challenge is to deal with the cluster of complexity that is the local church community, and to ask, what does this mean to belong to this? And part of the question has always got to be, what am I giving into this? I'm not simply a consumer. I'm not choosing between department stores. I'm not choosing between churches. I'm actually here. I need to live out something of my Christian vocation in this messy place. Bonhoeffer talks about the fact that we're called as individuals. You're called by God, and only you can answer the call. Only you can accept the offer of salvation. Only you will finally be judged for how you live. However, you're not called to live alone. You're called into the community. And it's in the community that we struggle, we pray, we are hurt, and yet we flourish. And ultimately, we find something more of ourselves than we could have found otherwise. So thank you, Dietrich, for that one.
Good old Dietrich. I can think of almost no better person to finish this podcast on. So thank you, John, for your time and for your input on this. That has raised a lot of questions, and questions that we'll continue to have on what it looks like to move beyond judgment, to move into healthy spaces and how we relate to others, into our world, how we remain faithful to Jesus, but also include and embrace and love our neighbor as Jesus put it. So thank you. And,
thank you for having me. It's been good to be de-churched, Jools.
You feel thoroughly de-churched in isolation as we are.
It's a very interesting dynamic.
Gathered in the scattered church, never Never felt so strange.
Scattered but not shattered.
There you go.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for listening. This has been dchurch.com. My name's Jools, and it's good to have you with us. See you next time.